So, I hate this meme. I wanna I wanna start with this meme, right? I hate when people would make that meme about like, oh, the ground-based Footsies Guilty Gear is known for. Because Guilty Gear is not predominantly focused around Footsies, right? It does not matter what game you play. Like, it's not like a slow-paced game. You're inching forward and like playing like screen positioning is important, but in different ways. It's primarily built around two things: strong offense and trying to force you to make a mistake. The latter is especially common if you are familiar with how Guilty Gear function, basically. Like, if you know things like the wake up timings, like they differed per character. Also, knockdown timings, weight classes were also very specific. Another one, for example, is in like mass attack, which like was a very interesting, because that meant that sometimes you'd have to take, like for safety, you take like combos that were essentially not real, right? But usually it meant it was more preferable to take non-real combos than get reset, right? Now, this is basically eliminated. The Stride is basically the game that completely eliminated this aspect of it. There are some elements similar, but it's basically not relevant anymore. But if you're like a plus R player or an Exert player, you've probably not thought of it like this, but this is basically the way the game is forcing you to play, right? It's built in a way to actually make you fuck up. With this in mind, right, if strong offense is what builds the game, how do you build footsies around it? Like, if the goal is to get like your offense going, then how do you actually get your offense going in a consistent manner? Again, it does not matter if you can just like run up full screen and make them block once. You could set play them to death. How often are you going to be able to do that? Not very often, right? Air moves in older Guilty Gears are very strong. As in, anti-airs in older games are quite inconsistent unless you're very good. Like, you're very good at either reacting or positioning yourself. In fact, this is one of the major gateways to actually people getting good in older Guilty Gears, because a lot of the matchup strategy was built around how you would move to anti-air, right? Like, there's some angles you would never be able to anti-air soul jump H, but there are other angles where you would always be able to anti-air soul jump H. Could be very strong force your game plan with, right? I don't really consider the air game. There are, quotations, air footsies, right? Like, I'm sure like a game, like I'd assume Melty, for example. I don't know if you'd call air footsies in that game or something like that a thing, but that's not really like a thing in Guilty Gear, right? Marvel probably did have some shit like that, right? But I guess Marvel also like filled the screen up with everything. That is why air throwing is huge, because you could essentially mitigate the risk reward around this interaction if you were very good air throwing, right? So essentially, if you became a stronger Guilty Gear player, you probably actually stopped using as much 6P and probably leaned towards air throwing way more, because it was the most consistent way to anti-air everything. So that means that essentially at a higher level, you could force game plans with your jump-ins. It developed into people focusing on air throwing to start their offense without taking risks. I know it sounds like we're gonna get into another FPS discussion, but I promise we're not, okay? This is essentially the Guilty Gear problem, right? Strong offense means like you could win the game, especially like it's super realistic for almost every set play character, because even if you are very good in the matchup, they probably have enough knowledge checks that you won't be able to cover them all, which is what made offense so strong, that there's like so many options that they can represent. How do you deal with strong offense if it's like you almost can't even build consistent defense against? So this is where Footsies came in. Forcing offense became a lot weaker as people became more comfortable with matchups, right? Which led to playing on the ground primarily. So this may sound weird, right? We've just talked about how Guilty Gear is not focused around footsies, right? It's built around strong offense and trying to make you make a mistake, basically. It actually ended up with people forcing so much shit that it ended up putting everyone in a position where the stronger thing is to just play on the ground and play footsies, right? So like, again, when people say like, oh, the ground-based footsies Guilty Gear is known for, that's actually true. It's actually real. It's a real thing, because you had to play footsies. Of course, like if you're not as familiar with matchups or you played against people who weren't, you like never had to do it. But playing on the ground was essentially like not optional if you played against someone who was familiar enough with the matchup. Essentially, you could force interactions, right, all the time. Like, it can work, and you can win off it. But of course, if you're wrong and it created a situation where, let's say, you force your game plan and people minimize the risk they take to challenge you. As a result of it, it results in them air throwing, starting their own offense, and then they killed you instead. Which meant that if that was the norm, the powerful way to kind of counteract this is to play on the ground and play footsies around it. Essentially, I know this is really weird. Why wouldn't you just want to start offense, right? Who cares, right? If I start offense, I win. In fact, I used to think like this, where I was like, I don't feel like playing neutral. Like, that was a real thought I had in my head. How I realized this was, if you're in lower levels, you may be like, oh, I just like steamroll, I just force offense, there's not much thought. Then you play against someone better, they just like anti-air you every time. But it's like, at low levels, you didn't even have to think about it, right? So then it can become more ingrained into your playstyle, where you just IAD and you can't control it all the time. Tell me if I just called you out. Because not only did I call you out, I called myself out circa 8 years ago. Even though offense is not the strongest part, offense, footsies I should say, footsies you could argue neutral, is not the key part of Guilty Gear. Through how strong offense is, or footsies, is just as important as offense. It's not a product of offense and footsies or neutral are equal, right? Like, this is not, it's not built around this. It's a product of how strong offense is. Having a game that's built around footsies and offense will create a much different, like, sort of situation. But if it's offense through neutral, or like neutral because like offense is so strong, then it will create the sort of situation where it's not optional. You know, all it takes is Soul to like force like one far slash, he like sends you to the 7th circle of hell, right? These are realistic outcomes for Guilty Gear. This is not new. Because offense is strong, you do not want to be put into a position where you have to block. Most of the time, people with strategies that do not want to block are not actually against blocking. It's more like they're uncomfortable being put in a position where they have to deal with something they can't predict, which means essentially they probably are not as familiar with how these characters run offense. Because you can make good defensive decisions, or it doesn't have to be stressful if you can essentially play the odds. You don't want to be in a position where you have to block. But because of how the game works, usually committing to options that makes you avoid blocking is almost always worse than just block. This is a very common problem for people that play Chip, Dizzy, Milia. So if we think about it like this, if we're avoiding blocking, then if you think about it, if we're going to take a risky decision, we want to not lose health, right? Essentially, we're just min-maxing around their decision-making and how to go from there. The correct adaptation to deal with powerful offense is to create a more stable neutral game to avoid this powerful offense. Because it does not matter how good their offense is if they can't play neutral with you. If you can't play neutral with someone, it does not matter if you've got every mix-up in the book. Like, you could do like, you know, twerk, kick flip, 360, no scope. Like, it does not matter. If you cannot get past someone's neutral, you're not gonna be that consistent against them. Like, period. Like, you can win interactions through like again, RPS, but you'll never be consistent. Yes, exactly. Guilty Gear incentivizes neutral because if you lose it, you're immediately dead. Yeah, that's actually how I have built a lot of my strategies. And I build them around like, if I lose neutral, I've lost the game, right? Like, that's basically how I view it. It does not always work that way. If it doesn't work, I'm still prepared, but I'm also aware of the risk and reward around just going ham, basically, right? Does that make sense? In bad matchups, it forces you to adjust because of how you get outranked, or how risk reward works. So again, like, no matter what, you cannot escape risk reward or RPS in like neutral. If you view something like Naga with high blood versus Soul, most of the time his buttons are going to be more dominant, right? They outrange him, and usually at that range, they'll get a huge return. The answer is not to just overcommit. This is like if you were in debt and you just started gambling all your money away in hopes of getting all your money back. You just make it worse. If you just go ham, it's like, well, it could work sometimes, but the overall strategy is not good. It's just not consistent. Movement can be a whiff punish. It's not necessarily direct, but being able to threaten your options more often, right, and RPS from there, even something like this is like, it can create maybe more of a like a two-step process, right, around like starting your game plan. Against Nago at max range, there's not much to be really worried about, right? Like, what's Nago gonna be afraid of? You pressing like 6S or like, you know, maybe Bringer. A lot of them are like bad risk reward. Right? It creates an RPS interaction that is in his favor. But if you move closer and then you force an RPS interaction around far S, that's a lot more equal, right? So you can view it as more like bad matchups equal or more. Actually, I'm gonna make a new row for this. Bad matchups are usually more around a process to start your offense. Do not skip your process. Even though you could just win by forcing your like strong mix-up, the best strategy is to actually play as stable as possible to avoid your opponent starting their strong mix-up. But basically, this leads into the idea of like, you know, if your strategy is to force your own strong mix-up, you can always do that. That's always a strategy you can't do. And usually this is how a lot of top tier characters function, which meant that if your like approach is just to gamble into them or force something, you make their strategy more reliable and yours less reliable, just in nature. So like, again, neutral was not necessarily important from the baseline, but if you viewed how strong offense was and how you would have to adapt to kind of deal with it, it made neutral as important or as like valuable. And this is how I approach every fighting game I play. Like when I played Uni, I approached it the same way. Obviously in Strive, I approach this the same way in Grand Blue. I'm gonna use it the same way in DNF. Everything I do is built on this strategy of like how offense or how defense can impact your neutral. It does differ depending on how powerful defensive options are. Like if it's extremely powerful, you don't want to just force defensive shit all the time. If you can win through neutral, that's how I would probably approach it. Almost always, depending on how defense or offense is, you'd probably want to put more emphasis into neutral, because if either option is as powerful as it is, you don't want to rely on the fact that they can just use the same thing on you, right? Because again, if your strategy is just overcommit in a game that's very, like, they have very strong offense, either your offense has to be godlike, and not everyone can do that. You want to play like neutral better. That's basically it. You can of course play like maybe like going ham on offense and then like going ham on defense. It's hard to be super consistent, and that's I've already established why I get this way. So